Today we're covering the Genki 1 3rd edition workbook, and I know that the question that most of you have is, should you buy it? The short answer is that if you have the 2nd edition workbook, no, you probably don't need to buy this one. If you don't have either, well, it's kind of up to you, so let's go over all the reasons that I think these are the best answers. The first thing you'll notice in the workbook is that there's no CD this time. Instead, people are going to use the Otonavi Sound Navigator application from the Japan Times to get their listening exercises for both the textbook and the workbook. This is actually probably more convenient for most people because I know I myself don't have a CD player on my computer anymore. Another thing you may notice early on is that there's actually a few more listening exercises or just audio examples for this workbook than there were for the original. For example, on page 15 and on page 25, we'll see that there's some listening exercises for numbers, which did not exist on the original CD. Another thing we'll notice that's changed immediately is that the section titles have changed slightly. For example, here we have kore, sore, are, kono, sono, ano. And in the original textbook, we also had the English word and. So they've removed some of the English from the section titles. It's just a small change. On top of this, they've also added Japanese to some section headers that didn't have it before. Like here for numbers, they added the Japanese suji, which of course means numbers. Now, most exercises in this workbook are in fact identical to the exercises in the 2nd edition of the workbook. For example, here on page 32, we've got the same exact verbs and the same exact tables for practicing conjugation. On the very next page, we've got the same exact nouns and the same exact exercises for practicing conjugation. One thing that you'll notice pretty early on is different is that they've also added some hiragana and katakana charts into the book. Now, on the back of these charts, they've got the romaji for each hiragana, and they recommend that you cut these out and use them to practice. Now, the thing is that they're extremely small, so I don't know how effective they'd be as a study tool, but it's something. The next thing I noticed that was changed in the new workbook is that the listening exercises and the question sections of each chapter have been reversed. So now the questions come first and the listening comprehension questions come second. Now this might make the flow a little bit easier because before with the listening section first, you'd pull out your CD, listen to the listening section, and then put it away and do the questions after that. This makes it a little bit smoother of a transition. You do everything you need to do with just the workbook, and then you can do the listening exercises at the end of the lesson. It's not a major change, but it is a smoother experience going through the workbook in this manner. Now, most of those listening comprehension questions are identical to the 2nd edition versions, but some of the exercises have changed a little bit. As we can see here on page 68, the B exercises have changed slightly. The situation is different. For example, Robert is staying in a smart hotel instead of someone dealing with their roommate. The type of exercise is the same. But if we look at the listening exercises on page 58, we see that they are identical to the 2nd edition versions. There have also been some minor quality of life updates in this edition. For example, here on page 79, you'll see that there's lines after the question and answer sections where you're supposed to write in the answers. They've also included which you would have had to repeat for each exercise so that you don't have to write the same thing over and over again. Now, this is a nice little quality of life update, but is it worth spending another $20 on if you already have the 2nd edition of the book? Probably not. Also, these changes are not consistent. If we turn the page over to page 81, we'll notice that another set of questions which those lines would really probably be pretty useful for does not have those lines, so you're just left to write as straight as you possibly can without them. Also, turning the page to page 84, we see that at the top we have some lines, but then down below in the question and answer sections, there's once again no lines. So, I'm not sure how they made the decision to add lines or not add lines, but it is what it is. Now, turning to page 88, we have the same situation as the first example I showed you, where we have copied for us and lines after the question and answers. Now, I do like this, but it's not a consistent change, and it's probably not worth spending $20 more if you've already got the original workbook. So before jumping over to the hiragana and kanji sections of the workbook, my impression of the main sections of the workbook is that it's mostly formatting changes and ordering changes, like with the listening and questions. And for example, here on page 107, we've got a table with various different activities. Now, all of the activities, if you check, are exactly the same as in the 2nd edition, but it looks different. They've organized them to be slightly more visually appealing, which is nice, but is it worth $20? Probably not. Moving over to the hiragana and katakana section, we'll see that it's essentially the same thing. There's some slight exercise changes, like on the very first page, 121, we'll see that section 2, choose the right romanization for each hiragana words, is slightly different from the second edition. Instead of writing in the romaji, we just pick multiple choice. It's a very small change, and that's pretty much what you'll see throughout the rest of the sections. But pages 126 and 127 do have completely different exercises than the second edition. Katakana is identical to the second edition. I didn't notice any changes there. The kanji exercises are also almost identical to the second edition. If we look at page 136, we'll notice that one section here doing days of the week does have a nicer format, giving us lines and then parentheses below to add the hiragana, but it's probably not a deal breaker. Jumping over to page 144, we'll notice that some of the questions have been updated or changed. For example, for number 1 on section 2, we've got I listen to music on the train as opposed to reading a newspaper. And for number 2, we have please turn on the light instead of making a questionnaire. I guess you could say it's been updated for modern times ever so slightly. There's a few more little changes like this throughout the exercises, but nothing drastically different. So my overall take on this workbook is that if you already have the second edition, the third edition workbook is not worth purchasing, as the changes are so minor to be almost unnoticeable, unlike the textbook, which I do recommend upgrading. If you do not have the second edition workbook, on the other hand, and you like doing workbook exercises, this edition is fine. So today's question is, do you like using workbooks? If not, what do you prefer to use? Please like and subscribe, stay safe, love ya, bye!